Okay, let's dive into some source material that kicks off with a pretty striking claim. It argues the assassination of President John F. Kennedy was way more than just a national tragedy.
Yeah, it uses the term coup d'etat, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
says it fundamentally altered America's path.
Exactly. And the source we're looking at, it's an excerpt from an audio recording featuring author and historian Jim Mars.
Right. And Mars presents this really specific and, let's be frank, pretty controversial narrative. He connects the dots, or at least the source material does, between the assassination and what it calls a long-standing shadow government.
So, our goal here in this deep dive is really just to unpack what this source material is claiming. We want to understand the story it tells, the connections it makes about, who it thinks was behind the assassination and what their bigger plan supposedly was.
And this is crucial. We need to say this right up front. We're presenting the content here impartially. Our job is just to relay the ideas and the perspective within this specific recording so you can get what the source is saying.
Definitely. We are absolutely not endorsing these views. We're just laying out the information from the source.
Okay, got that covered. So where does the source begin? It starts with America Today, right?
Yeah, it says the country's kind of lost its way, but interestingly, it argues the usual political fights, liberals versus conservatives, Democrats versus Republicans. That's all just what does it call it, a shadow show.
A shadow show, yeah. The idea being that this fighting you see is actually like manipulated by these other groups that calls them global fascists or national socialists.
And it claims they play both ends against the middle to stay in control.
It lays out a whole timeline for this supposed control structure, too. Goes way back.
Right. It mentions Thomas Jefferson even warning about bankers and the money supply, like planting a seed early on.
That's presented as a kind of foundational worry.
Hmm.
But the source really zeroes in on the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. That's painted as the moment, the key step where bankers allegedly grabbed control of the money supply, a fundamental power shift, according to this narrative.
Okay, so bankers gain control. Then the source jumps forward quite a bit, right? After World War II.
Correct. It talks about bringing in unreconstructed Nazis and embedding them deep within U.S. institutions.
Which institutions?
Things like the space programs like Operation Paperclip, though it puts a specific spin on it, the military-industrial complex, scientific research, even mind control projects in universities.
And the claim isn't just that the U.S. took Nazi technology.
No, that's the key point the source makes. It claims the U.S. accepted their ideology, too, which is a huge claim.
It really is. And the source tries to define its terms here. It says fascism is the combining of state, government, and corporate power.
And then, maybe the most eyebrow-raising one, it equates neoconservatism with National Socialism. Says it's just another name for it.
That's quite a statement.
Okay.
Okay, so how does JFK fit into this picture according to the source?
Well, it presents Kennedy as being sort of uniquely positioned to see this threat because of his education, his background, and especially his book, Why England Slouched.
This was about appeasing Hitler, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the source argues this gave him a special kind of insight, made him aware of the potential for, well, Nazi-like infiltration or ideology taking root.
And based on that awareness, the source claims he took specific actions. Actions that challenged this hidden power structure.
Yes, several are mentioned. There's the Kennedy Tax Act of 1962. The source frames this as an attempt to close tax loopholes for big multinational corporations, hitting them where it hurts.
It also claims Kennedy was planning to pull the U.S. out of Vietnam, based on many statements.
That's what the source asserts, yeah. A major policy shift that would have gone against certain interests. But maybe the biggest direct challenge mentioned is about the Federal Reserve.
What specifically?
The source claims that in 1963, Kennedy moved to limit the Fed's power. He apparently tried to issue something like $6 billion in currency directly from the Treasury Department.
Meaning not borrowing it from the Fed and paying interest.
Precisely. Non-interest-bearing currency. Bypassing the Fed system entirely. According to the source, this was a massive challenge to the bankers' control it talked about earlier, and a major reason, in its view, that he was targeted.
This narrative structure leads right into another really dramatic story the source highlights. Operation Northwoods, 1962.
Oh, yes, Operation Northwoods. The source describes this as a plan cooked up by the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
And the plan was?
Essentially, to stage fake terrorist attacks inside the United States. We're talking planting bombs in American cities, maybe assassinating Cuban exiles, hijacking planes, sinking boats.
Good grief. And then blame it all on who?
On Fidel Castro, to create a pretext, a justification for invading Cuba.
And the source is very clear. It claims this wasn't just some wild idea floated around. It says the plan was formally submitted and actually signed off on by the Joint Chiefs.
That's the assertion. Signed, sealed, delivered.
Okay.
But then comes Kennedy's role in the source is telling.
What did he supposedly do?
It claims he flat out rejected it, stopped it cold, reportedly saying something like, no, we don't operate this way, put his foot down.
And there are consequences for the people involved.
The source claims Kennedy fired Admiral Lemnitzer. It identifies him as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who pushed the plan and ordered all copies destroyed.
But one survived.
Apparently so. The source says one copy somehow survived and was eventually unearthed, thanks to the Assassination Records Review Board.
Which was set up after Oliver Stone's movie JFK, right, to declassify documents.
That's the one. And the source presents this discovered Northwoods document as, like, concrete proof. Proof of this national security state and the kind of things it was willing to plan.
So all these threads, the Fed challenge, Vietnam, Northwoods, the source ties them all together to frame the assassination itself.
Exactly. It paints the assassination as the absolute turning point. November 22nd, 1963, Dallas. The shots fired, the president hit. The source states very clearly that this date marked a turn downward for the U.S.
A loss of prestige, a decline that it says continues even now.
Yes. And it explicitly calls the assassination the benchmark for the ascendancy of this shadow government.
Meaning this was the moment they stepped out of the shadows, so to speak.
That's the implication. The source says they pulled off the gloves, made an overt move to create a coup d'etat. They felt powerful enough, presumably, to take that step.
Wow. And how does the source see power being consolidated after Kennedy was gone?
It moves on to Lyndon Johnson. Describes him as up for grabs, someone who knew who his masters were, and guided, it says, by a council of wise men.
Who were they?
Identified in the source as members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, a prominent foreign policy think tank, often mentioned in these kinds of narratives.
Okay, so LBJ is guided by the CFR according to the source. Then Nixon.
Richard Nixon, the source flatly claims, was put into power with help from Nazi money. Doesn't elaborate much beyond that, but makes the connection.
And then it highlights George H.W. Bush's appointment under Nixon.
Yes, and it digs into his family background. It brings up his father, Prescott Bush, describing him as a Nazi funder.
A Nazi funder. How?
The source claims Prescott Bush was prosecuted in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemies Act for handling money for the Nazis during wartime. It also connects him to something called the America-Hamburg Steamship Line.
Which it says was used for what?
As a conduit, basically, for Nazi spies and propaganda coming into the U.S. So the source is drawing this direct line from alleged Nazi funding and connections right up through the Bush family's rise in American politics.
So these individuals, their histories, as presented by the source, are all part of this picture of consolidating power behind the scenes.
That's the argument. And the source asserts this consolidation just kept going, strengthening through the Reagan years and getting even stronger today.
Which brings us back to the source's view of the present day.
Right. It reiterates that checks and balances are eroding, that the U.S. is moving toward, its words, a fascist-type system, and that there are deliberate efforts underway to destroy the Democratic Republic.
So after laying all this out, what's the source's final message? Does it offer a solution?
It does. It ends with a kind of call to action. It says people today know something's wrong in America, they feel it, but they don't know where to point the finger. Because of that shadow show of politics we talked about earlier.
The left versus right distraction?
Exactly. So the source says Americans, regardless of their background, need to stand up and actually point the fingers at these people. It claims have been manipulating history for, well, at least 60 years, probably 100 years.
And who are these people, according to the source?
It says they should be identified explicitly as National Socialist, Nazis, and Fascist.
And the goal of doing that?
To cleanse our body politic, as the source puts it, and get back to a constitutional republic. That's the end game it presents.
Okay. So wrapping this up, we've really walked through the source's very specific, very provocative narrative. It positions JFK's assassination not just as this awful tragedy, but as a deliberate coup orchestrated by a hidden shadow government with roots going way back.
A really detailed account, full of connections drawn across decades.
And just to reiterate one last time, we focus solely on presenting the claims, the story, and the connections made within the specific source material from Jim Marrs, so you can understand its perspective.
Absolutely. And maybe the final thought to leave you with, drawn directly from the source's perspective, is this. It claims all the political fighting you see today, all the division, might just be that shadow show. A performance designed by hidden players to keep you from seeing who the source alleges are the real manipulators.
What does that perspective, as laid out in this source, make you consider about how power might really operate behind the scenes? Something to think about.